with Marcia Gaudet, and she is the author of Carville, Remembering Leprosy in America. Marcia, your book is many people's stories. How many informants were involved, and what kind of documentation did you get a hold of to make the book happen?
Yes, I think there were different, some people where I interviewed extensively over almost 20 years, because I did my first interview in 1983, and the book was published 20 years later. And then I did some that I only interviewed very shortly, so all told it was almost 20 people. And, you know, I got my introduction to Carville by someone who actually had been at Carville and was a photographer near my hometown. And so he gave me sort of an introduction to it. He was the photographer who took our high school pictures. And, you know, so my impression of someone who had been a patient was very different from, you know, people who had never had any experience. And this was Johnny Harmon, and he ended up being one of my main interviews and people that I talked to. And Johnny's story was just fascinating. I mean, he learned photography while he was a patient, married another patient. They both, you know, were released from Carville after many years, and moved to her hometown, which was right near my hometown, and he became just one of the outstanding citizens. And when I called him to take the pictures for my wedding, I had a short engagement. It was only 4 months. He already had 2 weddings scheduled on that day, so he said he's sorry, but he couldn't do it.
Okay. So how far back does your book go? Some of the informants were then very recent, but...
Some of them were recent. Many of them, of course, the ones that I worked on in 1983 have died since. And a few of them that you know, had such good stories. And as I began to talk to more people, you know, I realized that there wasn't one story. There were things that the stories had in common, but some of the people who had come in, for example, the early ones were people who had been there in the late 1920s. And then people like Jose Ramirez, who had been there, you know, in the 70s, and their stories were very different. And I realized that I wanted to get as broad and to get all of the different experiences down. And I was in no hurry to get into press because I felt like when I did go to press with it, I wanted to make sure that, you know, at least I was satisfied that I had gotten the story at least as complete as I could.
And now, while Carville was a center for the treatment of Hansen's disease, and it was a hospital, the individuals who were there being treated, they led incredibly rich lives. They had their own, a newspaper, they had their own Mardi Gras. What about your book what about those lives did you most want to bring to the book? What did you want to change about people's perceptions of what was happening at Carville?
Well, 2 things that I thought was important was to show the ability of people to survive, and to survive with some dignity. Because especially for the early patients, a diagnosis was totally devastating. And yet, you know, even the worst losses they showed, you know, were recoverable. You know, you could go on even from a diagnosis of leprosy. So that was part of it that I thought that applied to any person, you know, who was dealing with loss or who was dealing with trauma. And then as I began to talk to some of the people, I realized that there were people who were, first of all, tremendously interesting in all they had done, and people who were wonderful narrators. I mean, they were really storytellers, like Johnny Harmon, like Billy Barton, and a few of the others.
Okay. And Carville was the only center for the treatment of Hansen's disease in North America?
In the continental United States.
There
was a place that, of course, has since closed, but there was one in Nova Scotia as well.
Okay. And in the history of the treatment of Hansen's disease, at what point did the range of antibiotics that are brought to bear on it now, when did that come about?
Really by the late 1960s, patients who entered then, usually, I mean, their treatment was certainly much more involved and much more painful than it is now. But they stayed by choice. That is, they weren't quarantined. And there was a multi-drug therapy, but at that time they weren't using the word cured. Now the disease can be arrested within 48 hours.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the contemporary drug treatment right now makes it totally unnecessary to have any kind of institutional care.
Now, of those that you interviewed and you talked with who've now encountered your book, what kind of reactions did they have?
The ones who read it and seemed to be happy with it.
Okay.
And I think that's why I didn't go to press very quickly. I'm not sure if that was by design, but I didn't really go to seek a publisher until Carville was closed as an inpatient treatment center. And those, of course, many of them had passed on, and so they didn't get a chance to read it. Their children seemed pleased with it. And those patients, who were very few of them actually, and let me say, it wasn't that they died from the illness, they died because of old age. And the last one, Mary Ruth, died only about 7 years ago.
To see Jose present today and to see more books come out about this subject matter, do you feel good about that? Do you feel,
Yes.
in essence, that you've started something about the history of Carville?
There were publications, of course, by patients before, but they tended to be done by presses that focused on religious types of writing, or some self-published. And I think Jose's book is getting much more, a much wider audience, and I'm very happy about that because, Jose is showing a different perspective, of course, from the inside, the perspective of a patient.
Okay, good. What's your next project?
I just published a book on Ernest Gaines.
Very good. Okay.
And now Barry Ossolet and I are working on a book that's going to be called Storm Stories. And this is about Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, but we're focusing on the stories of the rescuers, especially the what we're calling vernacular rescuers, the people who just tried to help and weren't official government sources. We're having great fun with it. And again, we waited quite a while before doing this because we felt that it needed some thought, that before people rushed into getting it published, that we wanted to see what the aftermath of that was. And so now we're working on it right now.
Very good. Thank you so much.